Now just started the recording, so that interruption won't be in there. So we're going to be in Ruth chapter 3 today, and you can all turn to there. But before we get some reading for Ruth chapter 3, we're going to summarize real quickly Ruth chapters 1 and 2 that we've already went through. So we start in with an Israelite family. We have a guy named Elimelech. He's the husband. His wife's name is Naomi, and they have two sons, Mahlon and Chilion. So they're basically living in Bethlehem, and Ephrathites living in Ephrathah. So not from the tribe of Ephraim, but from the place called Ephrathah. So they're wandering around, but there's a famine in the land, so they flee to the land of Moab. And there we have some tragedies happen. Naomi loses her husband, and her sons go ahead and marry these foreign Moabite wives. And these wives' names are Ruth and Orpah. So they're in Moab for a time about 10 years. And throughout all that time, they sadly don't have any children. The Israelites would generally view this as a curse of barrenness probably for marrying these foreigners and fleeing Israel into this foreign land. So we have this great problem here and these great tragedies. So eventually Mahlon and Chilion die as well, and Naomi has just lost her two dearly loved biological children. After that, she's left with these two daughter-in-laws. They make a way to travel back to the land of Israel after they heard that some food is there. But on the way, Naomi recommends her two daughters to, just go back to the land of Moab because they probably won't have much of a future in the land of Israel because they're foreigners, and Israelites didn't really look on foreigners very well. And they probably most likely would not be able to find any husbands there in Israel either, and they would live as widows, and it would be a very rough life for the widows. However, only Orpah goes back to Moab, and Ruth chooses to stay with her mother-in-law. So it's her mother-in-law. It's just this crazy thing. She didn't have to do that. There's no judgment on Orpah for going back as her mother-in-law told her to. But Ruth went out of her way in displaying the Hebrew term, which is the theme for this book that we've looked at, which is hesed, or pronounced chesed, if you want the Hebrew pronunciation there. So it's basically going out of your way in love, in graciousness, in mercy, in covenant faithfulness, doing more than is required of you, basically. So Ruth and Naomi both travel back to the land of Israel, and after some time, we're going to now be in chapter 2, they get this idea where, all right, you're probably going to have to go out and glean from these fields. And this was something that, was basically a safeguard in the law, the Israelite law, for any impoverished people, for any foreigners, and for any widows. And we know that Ruth at least fulfills the foreigner part and the widow part, and probably the impoverished part as well, because she has to go out and glean from these fields. So that was a method. So, worst of the worst, this was a method to stay alive and get some food. So it was a great thing for any of the poor people, anyone going through some rough stuff, and even any foreigners as well. The law took good care of them. So she's out gleaning from these fields and just so happens to come upon Boaz's field. And Boaz is one of their relatives from Elimelech's side. So one of their relatives, she just happens to be in that field, gleaning from that field, and Boaz takes notice of her. And essentially, he takes notice of her, he protects her, tells her to stay close to the other young women and servants that he has, and he specifically tells all his young men to not touch her or do anything to her. So he protects her, he provides for her as well, he gives her barley, he helps her glean from barley. And then we have, some really interesting things. Verse 14 there, after they've sort of gotten to know each other a little bit, Boaz said to her at mealtime, "Come here and eat from the bread and dip your morsel in the wine vinegar." So he is eating with her as well as all of his other servants. So it's a testament Boaz's nobility, his noble nature, and just how nice of a guy he is and a good person. He also follows the law because he lets her glean from this field and even helps her. He goes out of his way to give her this barley and things like that. So we also learn finally that Boaz is one of their redeemers, and a redeemer is essentially a person who kind of helps out and buys things that have either gone into foreign hands or has left hands. So if an Israelite was, had to be sold into slavery, maybe on super rough times, had to sell themselves into slavery, it was the Redeemer's job to come in and save that person from slavery by paying their redemption price and getting them out of slavery. This also applied to fields as well, and some other things such as propagating a lost relative's line. So if the husband died, then it was one of the relatives' job to come in there and propagate their line essentially and family name. That was one of the things. So we then finally finish with verse 23 of chapter 2 there. So she stayed close with the maidservants of Boaz to glean until the end of the barley harvest and wheat harvest, and she lived with her mother-in-law. So it seems like we've gotten into a state of complacency here. We've seen this Boaz guy. He seems like a great guy. We want the widowed Ruth to, end up with him. At least that's how the story is going. But then we end on this note of complacency, and it looks like things aren't going to happen. However, in chapter 3, we quickly learn that even though things aren't happening on Boaz's end, maybe he's respecting her mourning period for being a widow since she's lost her husband, and we don't really see any advances on Ruth's side as well. So Naomi, the mother-in-law, takes it upon herself to kind of push things along, so to speak, and that's at the beginning of chapter 3 there. Do we have any volunteers to go ahead and read for us, let's say, just all of chapter 3? Whatever translation you use is fine, too.
I can.
Yeah, that would be great.
Okay, let me find it. I'm on the right page, I just don't know where to find it. Okay. I'm using the Christian Standard Bible, by the way. Ruth's mother-in-law, Naomi, said to her, My daughter, shouldn't I find rest for you so that you will be taken care of? Now isn't Boaz our relative? Haven't you been working for his female servants? This evening he will be winnowing barley on the threshing floor. Wash, put on perfumed oil, and wear your best clothes. Go down to the threshing floor, but don't let the man know you are there until he has finished eating and drinking. When he lies down, notice the place where he's lying. Go in and uncover his feet and lie down. Then he will explain to you what you should do. Sir said to her, I'll do everything you say. She went down to the threshing floor and did everything her mother-in-law had charged her to do. After Boaz ate, drank, and was in good spirits, he went to lie down at the end of the pile of barley. And she came secretly, uncovered his feet, and lay down. At midnight, Boaz was startled, turned over, and there lying at his feet was a woman. So he asked, Who are you? I am Ruth, your servant, she replied. Take me under your wing, for you are a family redeemer. And he said, May the Lord bless you, my daughter. You have shown more kindness now than before, because you have not pursued younger men, whether rich or poor. Now don't be afraid, my daughter. I will do for you whatever you say, since all the people in my town know that you are a woman of noble character. Yes, it is true that I am a family redeemer, but there is a redeemer closer than I am. Stay here tonight, and in the morning, if he wants to redeem you, that's good. Let him redeem you. But if he doesn't want to redeem you, as the Lord lives, I will. Now lie down until morning. So she lay down at his feet until morning, but got up while it was still dark. Then Boaz said, Don't let it be known that a woman came to the threshing floor. And he told Ruth, Bring the shawl you're wearing and hold it out. And when she held it out, he shoveled 6 measures of barley into her shawl, and she went into town. She went to her mother-in-law, Naomi, who asked her, What happened, my daughter? Then Ruth told her everything the man had done for her. She said, He gave me these 6 measures of barley, because he said, Don't go back to your mother-in-law empty-handed. Naomi said, My daughter, wait until you find out how things go, for he won't rest unless he resolves this today. Okay, that's the end.
Perfect. So just to summarize real quick, and if anything stands out to you guys, just keep that in mind so that he can bring it up. So chapter 3, as before in chapter 2, there's like this sense of complacency at the end, but Naomi goes ahead and takes things into her own hands and comes up with this scheme, essentially, and that's exactly what our commentator Daniel Block calls it. He calls it a crazy scheme, essentially. So basically tells her daughter to, all right, freshen up a bit, and then go to the threshing floor where Boaz is going to be for the evening, uncover his feet, and sleep there for a while. So this crazy scheme to kind of get the ball rolling, I guess you could say. And while they're there, and there's so much cultural and language stuff in here, but one of the things that I'll mention, at least right now, and probably other things later, but in verse 9 there, and he said, "Who are you?" And she said, "I am Ruth, your servant. Spread your garment over your servant, because you are a redeemer." And calling yourself a servant is just it's pretty much a term of humility. She wasn't really actually a servant or a hired servant or anything like that. It was just a term of humility used there. And spread your garment over your servant. Spread your garment over. That is essentially an idiom for marriage. So Ruth essentially says, "I am Ruth, your servant. Marry me, because you are a redeemer." And that's pretty much exactly what she says, and it's more of a command there as well. Marry me, because you are a redeemer. Again, appealing to some cultural stipulations there in the law. So that's pretty much where it is. And last week I told you guys to take a look at chapter 3 and note any suspense, and we do see some suspense as well. So we see that Boaz is the person that we want Ruth to be married to. He seems like a great guy. They even have this crazy scheme from her mother-in-law trying to get them together. But Boaz kind of takes a step back a bit, and he says, well, hold on a minute. I may be a redeemer, but there's a redeemer even closer in line than I am. So it seems that, everything might be falling apart right here. We don't want Ruth to get married to some random guy that we don't know. We know Boaz. We know he's a great guy. He's got a great relationship with his workers. He's been very great and kind to Ruth as well. But we don't know this random guy. We don't want Ruth marrying him. So that is the suspense in chapter 3. So did anything stand out to you guys in the entire chapter? Or anything else in the book of Ruth? Anything you want to bring up?
Didn't they mention some other redeemer?
Yes,
Let me look.
there
Yeah.
is another redeemer. So I could probably find, or someone could, yeah, it's verse 12 there. "Now truly I am a redeemer, but there's also a redeemer of a closer relationship than me." So we don't know if Boaz is going to marry Ruth at this point.
Ruth could go to that other redeemer.
Yes, that is a possibility, and where all this suspense comes from. So yeah,
Yep.
verse 13 there, "Stay tonight, and in the morning, if he wants to redeem you, good. But if he is not willing to redeem, then as Yahweh lives, I will redeem you." And that is Boaz's promise there. And really, just the way it's phrased, he's really gung-ho about all of this, and making an oath to God specifically too. So any other thoughts that you guys had and thought that was interesting about the passage?
Probably verse 14, where he said, where they told her to get up and get out before anyone could recognize her, and that he tells her that, hey, no one can know that you were down here.
Yeah, that is something really great to bring up, because they apparently, despite all the cultural gaps that we have between this time period, they apparently knew, Boaz and Ruth, that this is not a good situation for someone to find themselves in. It looks super sketchy, and someone walking in on this scene wouldn't know what happened, and they wouldn't know what Ruth is doing over here. And this goes back to some really weird stuff. So we have the instructions here from Naomi. So first of all, she tells Ruth to go to the threshing floor, which was usually, well, not usually, but it was at least in the time of the judges, according to our commentator, these prostitutes would generally go to the threshing floor in the evening for, different acts of promiscuity with the rich landowners who were at the threshing floor and things like that in the evening. So that was one of the things to keep in mind. And another thing is that Naomi tells her to, wash, anoint yourself, put your clothing on, things like that in verse 3 as well, might be taken as, some sort of prostitution, at least get up and getting ready for something like that. And, this problem is propounded on with phrases like verse 4 there. Take notice of the place where he lies, and you shall go and uncover his feet and lie down. And in this, and you shall go and uncover his feet and lie down. In this, there are 3 potential double entendres and euphemisms for sexual acts, essentially. So if you're familiar with people in the Old Testament, whenever you read lying down with someone, that might be a euphemism for sex. Whenever you see uncovered the other person, that might be a euphemism for sex. And feet itself could be a double entendre for something as well. So we see 3 double entendres, at least possible double entendres there. And there's also, there's so much cultural stuff here and callbacks to the Old Testament, but there's also kind of an allusion, perhaps, back to, I think it was Lamech and his 2 wives, or maybe Lot. Yeah, it was Lot and his 2 wives. So they were fleeing from Sodom and Gomorrah, and, well, I shouldn't say wives, they were his daughters, which makes it much worse. So Lot and his 2 daughters, essentially they got him drunk because they thought they were the only people left in the world after the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. So they got him drunk, and then they slept with Lot to propagate their children in line because they thought everyone else was dead. And this is actually, interestingly enough, this is actually where the line of Moab came from Lot's eldest daughter. So that's where the line of Moab came from, and we know that Ruth is a Moabite. So it's an interesting parallel there, but we have to remember the context of the story. And it's kind of hard to see it because all of it's in Hebrew, but the way that the author of Ruth phrases all of these things and how he or she is so careful to phrase these things in such a way. So first, regarding the parallel of Lot being just completely blind, drunk, we know that Boaz, he probably drank a little bit. Verse 7 there of Ruth chapter 3, and Boaz ate and drank until his heart was merry. But the Hebrew here does not entail blind drunkenness or any drunken carousing or anything like that. It's a good amount, not too much, just a little bit, and he's in good spirits essentially, and there's nothing bad about this. So, we know Boaz is a man of good character, as we have seen from the previous chapters. And while verse 4 might be taken as a few double entendres, he probably shouldn't. What the author is most likely doing is calling back to these Moabite allusions and playing on the Israelites' perception of the Moabites, as promiscuous people, as bad people who have all these idols and lead Israelites astray. So the author's kind of playing on that, but then rests on their integrity. We know Ruth, as a character, would never do something sexually promiscuous like this, and we know that Boaz would not allow something like that either. So it's just a play on words, essentially, but we know that it doesn't end up that way and that they actually don't do any of those things. And this is especially reinforced with Boaz's reply in verse 10 there. And he said, "You are blessed by Yahweh, my daughter. You did better in this last kindness than the first." So if she was acting sexually promiscuous, or was called to be sexually promiscuous by her mother-in-law, Boaz's remark here just wouldn't make any sense at all in the context there. And also just another note, when Boaz says daughter here, it doesn't mean, well, we all obviously know that it's not his biological daughter or anything like that. It's simply a term of endearment focusing on a sense of security and protection and provision. So Boaz using this term of endearment essentially means he's saying, I'm going to protect you, I am going to provide for you as well, as if you were my own daughter. And that's essentially what that term there means. It's also a callback to verse 1 there, when Naomi asked the rhetorical question, my daughter, should I not seek for you security, that things may be good for you? So a couple translations render this as, should I not seek for you a home? And the CSB from Frosted, who just read that, should I not seek for you rest, that things may be good for you? And this is essentially an allusion to, should I not seek for you a husband who will protect for you, provide for you, and spread his garment over you, or spread his wing over you, literally, and, again, idiom to marriage. So just really interesting things. I talked a lot there, but, I kind of want to bring the floor over to you guys if you have any thoughts, or if you want to ask any questions about any of the cultural things there as well. Any thoughts? Yeah, that's completely fine. No worries. It's it's hard to get any discussion on narrative chapters because we just see what happened, right? We don't have to debate on theology much or anything like that. So I guess we can go ahead and start wrapping things up essentially. So chapter 2 ends with a sense of complacency. We kind of think that, hey, well, maybe this is the only thing that's going to happen. Nothing else. She's just going to keep harvesting wheat, gleaning from the field and things like that. But then Naomi takes it upon herself, in a crazy twist in the story here. She takes it upon herself to get the ball rolling, get things going, kind of matchmake these two together. And so she comes up with this crazy scheme, do all these things and just lay at his feet until he wakes up and then ask him to marry you. And that's essentially exactly what Ruth does there. I guess one other thing to note, is she goes from verse 9 there, I am Ruth, your servant, and then demands something from Boaz, marry me because you are a redeemer. She's lecturing him on these cultural stipulations and the law stipulations. And Boaz says, all that you ask, I will do for you. And that's verse 11. And so then, my daughter, do not be afraid. All that you ask, I will do for you. So it's a switching of roles here. Ruth calls herself the servant, is completely humble, but then marry me. And Boaz then takes the role, essentially, of servanthood and says, all that you ask, I will do for you, even though he didn't have to. He was the superior in this sense of being the landowner, and Ruth being the widowed foreigner who's gleaning from his field. So after that, we learn of kind of a wrench in the plans here. Pretty much the suspense of the story, the next big conflict. So we hear that there is apparently another redeemer closer in line. And, we don't want Ruth to end up with this random person that we don't know. We want her to end up with Boaz. And he says, stay tonight, verse 13, and in the morning, if he wants to redeem you, good. But if he is not willing to redeem, then as Yahweh lives, I will redeem you. And we see maybe, and this is speculation, but of course this is how the author wants us to think. So we see pretty much this note of kind of sadness in Boaz's words. If he wants to redeem you, good. But if he is not willing to redeem you, and this promise is extremely emphasized, it's hard for me to emphasize it, but it's so much more emphasized with this oath to God. Then as Yahweh lives, I will redeem you. Boaz stepping up, he's making this noble promise. And, finally, even though the mother-in-law hatched this crazy scheme and we have this cultural gap between us and the story, we know that Boaz and Ruth realize this crazy situation would not be interpreted well if anyone saw them. So he tells her to get up before anyone can recognize her, before anyone can see her. Verse 14 at the end there, and he said, "It must not be known that you came to the threshing floor," because, they both had, I guess, reputations to keep up, and nothing bad happened there, and they don't want anyone wandering in on the situation and assuming that anything bad happened there either. So finally we end in verse 18 with this terrible cliffhanger, at least for this study, but you guys can read chapter 4 real quickly if you want to later. But this crazy cliffhanger in verse 18, "And she said, 'Wait, my daughter, until you know how the matter turns out, for the man will not rest, but will settle the matter today.'" And we know that marriage is something that you don't normally rush into. But here's Boaz: the man will not rest. He will settle the matter this very day. And we, as the audience, at least just at the end of chapter 3, we want to know how this story is going to turn out. And the author has left us on this cliffhanger and making us essentially turn the page to the next chapter. And that is where chapter 3 ends. Next week, of course, we will be in chapter 4. Would anybody like to close us out with a word of prayer? All right, I'll go ahead and do so. Let's bow our heads in reverence. Dear Heavenly Father, I thank you again for just this wonderful day that you've given us, this wonderful day that we can actually live even in your providence and your provision that you've provided us with this day to live in. I pray for everyone here as well, whatever they're going through. Please be with them and please help them through it, that they might have strength from you to get through whatever they are going through. And dear Lord, I thank you for this story of Ruth and Boaz, and I thank you most importantly for the very son that you have given us, who comes from the line of Ruth and Boaz, and that we can be able to get some insight into the great amount of hesed that these two people have shown in their lives, being with each other and caring for one another, and eventually getting married to one another, all according to your great provision and providence, Lord. And we see that so much in this story, how they just so happened to come upon Boaz's field, and how Boaz just so happened to take notice of her. And even with the mother-in-law's crazy scheme that could have gone so badly, if someone noticed them and kind of railed them out and ratted them out and assumed the worst that happened, or if Boaz himself, when he woke up, maybe he's been drinking, he woke up maybe a little groggy in the middle of the night, in his good character, he might have tossed Ruth away and told her to get out of here, thinking her to be a prostitute, as was common in the day. That could have gone so terribly wrong. Or, he could have given in to any potential temptations there as well. But he didn't, because he was a man of good character, and so was Ruth, even in light of the mother-in-law's crazy scheme here, and all according to your providence. None of that happened, and they eventually got married to one another. And, even though we go through some bad things in life, Lord, we know that Ruth herself lost her dear husband of 10 years. She lost her husband. She's probably been in mourning for all that time period as well. But you made things work out, and you made it work out for the good as well. And I thank you for all of that, Lord, and I pray that we will be able to trust in your plan and trust in heaven, most importantly, as well, and nothing worldly, that we can hope for the benefits and gifts of heaven rather than the benefits and gifts of earth. And I pray all of these things and ask all of these things in Jesus' mighty name. Amen.
Amen.